David Harrison, the attorney representing Coley McCraney, the man accused in the double murder of Tracie Hawlett and J.B. Beasley, held a press conference this morning. Morning anchor Tanya Pruitt there and has reaction from Coley McCraney's family tonight.
In the summer of 1999, two 17-year-old girls were shot in the head and left in the trunk of a car on a quiet street in Ozark, Alabama. Two teenage girls who should have been worrying about graduation, friendships, and the future instead became the center of a mystery that would haunt an entire town. Their lives ended in silence, and for years, that silence was all anyone had. For the next 20 years, no one could say who did it. Imagine spending 2 decades without answers. Birthdays came and went. Parents grew older. Friends tried to move on. But every passing year only made the questions heavier. When the answer finally arrived, it broke a record, and it came from a place no investigator had ever thought to look. Over those 2 decades, 3 different names were attached to this one murder. The first belonged to a man who walked into a police station on his own and confessed. The second belonged to the police themselves, accused of pulling the trigger and hiding it. And the third, which was the correct one, belonged to a church-going truck driver who lived less than a mile from where the girls were found, and whom not one detective questioned until the case was old enough to vote. 1 crime, 3 names, 2 of them wrong. And the man who was right about none of the early theories walked free the entire time the town was looking everywhere else. The most frightening part wasn't that the killer escaped. It was that he never had to run. He simply waited while everyone searched somewhere else. Here is the question that has kept this case alive for a quarter of a century, and the reason you'll want to stay to the end. How does a killer stay invisible for 20 years while living in plain sight? And what finally dragged him out of it? Stick around, because what happens in the next 20 minutes will make you question everything about who we trust behind the pulpit. Before we go further, take a second to subscribe so you don't miss how this unfolds, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. We read them, and we reply. Now let's get into it. It all started with a car that shouldn't have been there. On the morning of August 1st, 1999, Ozark police found a black 1993 Mazda 929 parked along Herring Avenue, about 30 yards from a side street intersection in a residential part of town. Both families of the 2 missing Dothan teenagers had called police only hours earlier. Officers didn't have to search. The car was right there, and everything about it was wrong. The gas tank was nearly empty, though it had been filled the day before. The body of the car was streaked with mud. The driver's window was cracked open, but every door was locked. On the dashboard sat J.B. Beasley's driver's license. Inside were both girls' purses, their cash, their jewelry, their credit cards. Nothing had been taken. Whatever this was, it was not a robbery. For their families, every untouched belonging became another painful reminder. The purses could be returned. The jewelry could be identified, but the daughters who owned them were gone forever. There was no key anywhere, and on the lid of the trunk, a single palm print. That print told investigators where they needed to look, and for hours they couldn't get there. The trunk was locked, the key was gone, and officers treated the car as sealed while they worked the scene around it. It took most of the day before someone realized the trunk could be released from an interior latch, with no key required. When they opened it, both girls were inside. Each had been shot once in the head with a 9mm handgun. A shell casing was recovered. It was the moment every parent prays never comes. The moment hope quietly gives way to heartbreak. What had begun as a search for 2 missing teenagers had become a homicide investigation. They had been in that trunk the entire morning, on a street where people walked their dogs and left for work, while the search that was supposed to find them circled everywhere else. To understand what these 2 girls were doing in Ozark at all, you have to go back one night and to who they were. J.B. Beasley turned 17 on July 31st, 1999, the same day she died. Her full name was Hilton Green Beasley. She was born in Troy, Alabama, raised in Dothan by her mother, Cheryl Burgoon, and had modeled locally alongside her sisters and danced most of her life, with a shelf of trophies to show for it. She was the outgoing one, the kind of teenager who filled a room and knew it. The gathering the girls were driving toward that night was her own birthday party. Her best friend was her opposite. Tracie Jean Hawlett, also 17, was quieter and steadier, the responsible older sister at home. Her father, Robert Hawlett, had been a police officer. He drowned in Lake Eufaula in 1987 when Tracie was 5, and after that the local force knew the family by name. Her mother, Carol Roberts, worked long shifts as a nurse's aide. The two girls had met through cheerleading and become close to the point of inseparable. The night of July 31st, they set out to celebrate JB's birthday at a gathering a few towns over. They took JB's Mazda, 2 teenagers, a full tank of gas, and a set of directions they could not seem to follow. They got lost almost immediately. Around 10:30, they stopped at a BP station in Headland and used a payphone to call friends for help. It didn't work. Instead of reaching the party, they drifted more than 20 miles in the wrong direction and ended up in Ozark, a town neither of them knew, on unlit roads with no landmarks. At roughly 11:35, they pulled into the Big Little Store, a closed convenience store and gas station on East Broad Street. Tracie used the payphone to call her mother and said they were lost. They'd asked for directions, and they were finally heading home. A woman named Marilyn Merritt had stopped in for a soda with her daughter, and the girls asked her the way back to Dothan. Merritt walked them through it. She remembered them clearly afterward, polite, calm, a clean car, 2 kids who just wanted to get home. She watched them pull out and turn right, exactly as she'd directed. Marilyn Merritt was the last person to see J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett alive. Now, back to the evidence, because the scene held the 2 things that should have solved this fast, and the one problem that would keep it unsolved for 20 years. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head for each girl. There was no forced entry, no robbery, and no obvious motive. Then, more than 2 months later, the state crime lab returned a finding that reframed the entire case. Biological evidence had been recovered from J.B. Beasley's body and clothing, DNA left by an attacker, pointing to a sexual assault. Sit with what that meant. Investigators now had a genetic profile of the killer and a palm print from the trunk, the 2 most valuable pieces of physical evidence a 1999 investigation could hope for. And they had no one to compare either of them to. The DNA matched no one in any database. The palm print matched no one either. The evidence that would eventually convict the murderer was already sitting in an evidence locker within weeks of the crime. It would sit there, unreadable, for 2 decades. That gap, everything needed to catch him and no way to identify him, is what turned this from a case into a saga. And it's why the first person to take the blame was someone who had nothing to do with it. Keep watching, because the next 3 suspects tell you everything about how far off the rails this investigation went. And if you're finding this useful, hit subscribe now so the rest reaches you. Exactly 1 month after the bodies were found, the case seemed to solve itself. It didn't. On September 1st, 1999, a 28-year-old Ozark local named Johnny William Barentine walked into the police department and said he'd witnessed the murders. He lived less than a mile from Herring Avenue. He claimed that on the night the girls vanished, he'd gone out for milk and seen the whole thing happen. Investigators sat him down for a 4-hour interview, and over those 4 hours his story changed at least 6 times. First, it was a black truck speeding from the scene. then a tattooed stranger he'd picked up and followed. Then that stranger became his own neighbor. In the fullest version, he described a man forcing the girls from the car, a struggle, the trunk, 2 gunshots, and himself driving the killer away afterward. Ozark Police Chief Tony R. Spivey said Barentine could describe things a bystander shouldn't have known, and at a preliminary hearing, Alabama Bureau of Investigation agent Charles Huggins testified that Barentine had detailed the girls' clothing and other specifics consistent with the scene. Police arrested him and charged him with 2 counts of capital murder. The chief told reporters they had the right man. They didn't, and it fell apart quickly. Barentine never once mentioned the sexual assault, the single most important fact in the case. The neighbor he named had a solid alibi, and when Barentine's DNA was compared against the evidence from J.B. Beasley, it didn't match. Neither did the neighbors. Under questioning, Barentine admitted the truth. He had invented all of it, hoping to collect the reward money. His mother, Faye Barentine, said he'd been pressured. His court-appointed attorneys, Bill Cominos and Joe Gallo, argued there was no gun and no physical evidence, only a confession that contradicted itself. Judge P.B. McLaughlin denied him bond anyway. He was released that December. In January 2000, a grand jury declined to indict him. Johnny Barentine walked out cleared, a man who confessed to a double murder he had no part in, and who has since died. His name was the first of 3 attached to this crime, and it was wrong. With Barentine gone, the investigation widened, and every promising lead ended the same way. There was a man from Michigan, seen near where the car was found, who left town within days. Investigators traveled to Michigan 3 separate times to interview him, because he couldn't account for several hours of that night. DNA ruled him out. There was a man from Mississippi, extradited on an unrelated Ozark warrant, who'd been staying with relatives in town and left 2 days after the murders. Nothing connected him, and they let him go. There was a small white pickup truck caught on the Big Little Store surveillance camera around the time the girls were at the payphone, but no gas was purchased, the driver's face was never resolved, and the truck was never identified. And in March 2000, a woman told police she'd heard screaming and 2 gunshots near Highway 123 that night, but had been too afraid to come forward. Officers searched and found a single unfired 9mm round. Right caliber, wrong brand. No usable markings. Every one of these was a maybe. Every one became a dead end. The DNA stayed unmatched. The case went cold. And then, more than a decade later, it came roaring back from the last direction anyone expected, the police force itself. This was the second name attached to the case, and it wasn't one name, but a group of them. In 2015, a former Ozark auxiliary officer named Rena Crum came forward with a claim that turned the case inside out. She said the killer wasn't a stranger at all. She said he was an Ozark police officer, and that other officers had covered it up. Her account reached the public through a local blogger named John Carroll, who ran a site called the Henry County Report and published it in detail. The theory ran like this. The girls had come into possession of cassette tapes tied to local corruption and a drug operation. A traffic stop that night went wrong, and a cover-up followed to protect the badge. Crum pointed at named figures, among them Rex Tipton, Butch Whittington, Eddie Henderson, and Chief Tony Spivey. One of JB's sisters, Jackie Burgoon, and a Houston County deputy, Donovan Arias, were drawn into chasing it down. It spread across true crime forums and social media until it looked, to a lot of people, like the real answer. It landed everyone in court, just not the way the theory predicted. In early 2016, a group of current and former Ozark officers sued Crum, Carroll, and a former officer named Dean Matthews for defamation. That suit was dismissed in 2018. In a separate matter, Crum was convicted of harassing one of J.B. Beasley's sisters and received a suspended sentence and a small fine. For years, the defense in this case would treat Rena Crum as its trump card, a witness who could put a badge on the killer and blow the prosecution apart. Hold on to that, because when she finally raised her hand and testified under oath, what she said stopped the theory dead. We'll get there. Here is where the case finally broke. Not on a witness, not on a confession, but on a technique. For most of 2 decades, the DNA from J.B. Beasley could only be run against criminal databases, and the man who left it had never been arrested for anything that would put him in one. So it matched no one. That was the wall. Then, in April 2018, a case out of California tore that wall down for everyone. Investigators identified the Golden State Killer, Joseph James D'Angelo, using genetic genealogy, uploading crime scene DNA to public ancestry databases, building a family tree from distant relatives, and working inward to a suspect. It was national news. And in Ozark, Police Chief Marlos Walker was paying attention. Time had erased memories, scattered witnesses, and buried old leads. But it couldn't erase the DNA. The killer may have believed he'd left behind a mystery, but what he had really left behind was evidence waiting for science to catch up. His department sent the evidence to Parabon NanoLabs, a firm specializing in genetic genealogy. Parabon uploaded the profile to a public database called GeneMatch. There was no close match, no first, second, or third cousin waiting to be found. But there were distant relatives, enough to build a family tree and narrow it, branch by branch, toward a cluster of surnames, and finally toward one man who had never appeared in the case a single time. His name was Coley Lewis McCraney. This was the third name, and unlike the first 2, no one had ever spoken it, for a simple reason: there was nothing about him to speak. No record, no tie to the girls, no complaint, no rumor, no reason for a single detective to write him down. He was the last person the town would have guessed. He'd graduated from Carroll High in Ozark in 1992. He served in the Air Force from 1993 to 1997. He drove trucks for a living. He had helped found a church and served as its bishop. He had no violent record. To confirm the lead, investigators asked McCraney for a voluntary DNA sample. He gave one. The lab reported a match to the evidence from J.B. Beasley with a high degree of confidence. If genetic genealogy is why cases like this one get solved now, and you want more of them, broken down this way, this is the moment to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what investigators found next put the whole 20-year picture into focus. Look at where McCraney had been in 1999. That summer he lived on Lisenby Drive, less than a mile from the payphone the girls used, and less than a mile from Herring Avenue, where the car was found. And within roughly 18 days of the murders, he moved. He had been living in the middle of the map this entire time. In March 2019, officers stopped McCraney in Daleville, Alabama, and arrested him, 20 years after 2 teenagers were found a mile from his old front door. He was charged with capital murder and rape. He told police he didn't know the girls. At the preliminary hearing that April, Ozark Lieutenant Michael Bryan laid out the geography and the timeline, how close McCraney had lived to every point that mattered, and how quickly he'd relocated. Investigators noted McCraney had owned a 9mm, the same caliber used in the killings. Forensic testimony described gunpowder found on the girl's hands, a detail that spoke to how close the weapon had been. The defense argued the DNA proved contact, not murder. A judge sent the case to a grand jury. McCraney was indicted, and the case that had gone cold for 20 years was finally headed to trial. It took until 2023 to get there, and the trial delivered the twist the whole case had been building toward. Before it began, the defense's great hope took the stand at a pre-trial hearing. Rena Crum, whose cover-up allegations had shadowed the case for 8 years. If she held to her story, she could hand the jury reasonable doubt with a badge on it. Instead, after struggling to recall the specifics, she said 2 words: "I lied." The police cover-up theory that had lived online for nearly a decade collapsed in a single sentence, under oath. The second name was gone, leaving only the third. The trial ran about 2 weeks, with Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall personally leading the prosecution and Judge William Fillmore presiding. The state's case rested on the DNA, the one piece of evidence that had outlasted every false lead and every cold year. Then McCraney did something his own attorneys, David Harrison and Andrew Scarborough, may not have wanted. He took the stand. He testified that he had met J.B. Beasley at a Dothan mall and that the two had a consensual encounter, that this, and nothing else, explained why his DNA was on her. He denied killing anyone. But the defense offered no evidence the two had ever met before that night, and the jury heard a man explaining away the single fact that tied him to 2 dead teenagers. On April 26, 2023, they convicted him of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, for Cheryl Burgoon and Carol Roberts, 2 mothers who had waited nearly 24 years for justice. It was an answer they had stopped expecting, but the verdict didn't settle it. For the mothers, no sentence could bring their daughters back. But after decades of unanswered questions, they finally had something they had been denied for so long: the truth. McCraney's team went straight for a new trial, alleging jurors had broken the rules by posting to social media and reaching for outside information during deliberations. In July 2023, Judge Fillmore shut it down, and guards moved McCraney to a maximum security prison outside Birmingham. He kept fighting. In September 2024, the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction. That December, the state's highest court refused to hear the case at all. His state appeals were finished. McCraney is not. From his cell, he tells anyone who will listen that he is innocent, that a court will overturn this, that he will walk free. His attorney says the next stop is the U.S. Supreme Court. For the families who waited a generation for a verdict, the case they believed was closed is, technically, still open, and the man they watched convicted is betting the last door hasn't shut. So here is where 24 years of investigation leaves us. The science answered the biggest question: who? DNA that sat untouched for 2 decades, run through a method that didn't exist when the crime happened, put Coley McCraney in a courtroom and then a cell. But it never answered why. There was no robbery, and no one has ever proven a prior connection between him and either girl. 2 17-year-olds made one wrong turn on a summer night, ended up on a road they didn't know, and crossed paths with a man who was never supposed to be a suspect. Whatever the motive was, it left with them. Along the way, this case burned through a false confessor who talked his way into a jail cell, a viral theory that put the crime on the police and dissolved with 2 words under oath, and a killer who spent 20 years living an ordinary life a mile from where it happened. 3 names, and only the quietest one was true. That is the part that stays with people. He was not a monster in the shadows. He was a neighbor no one thought to look at twice. There are no easy sides to leave you on. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were 17, with lives they never got to live, and 2 mothers have carried that every day since. And the answer, when it finally came from a machine reading a genetic profile that a killer never imagined could be read. Both of those things are true at once, and that is what makes this case so hard to look away from. The conviction stands. The appeals are nearly out of road. And the one question the state never managed to answer, why these 2 girls on that night, has now outlasted everyone who might have known. There are no easy endings to a story like this. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were only 17. They should have grown into adulthood, built careers, started families, and lived the lives that were stolen from them on a quiet Alabama road. Instead, they became part of a mystery that lasted nearly a quarter of a century. We'll be covering any ruling from the higher courts as it comes. Subscribe and turn on notifications so the update reaches you the moment it breaks. And tell us in the comments, after everything, do you believe the DNA closed this case completely? Or is there still a piece of that night no one has explained? We read every one of them.